Chapter 17. Here we go. We get to talk about securities laws. You know, I'm more of a small government kind of a person, but I have to admit that some of the securities laws that are in place I enjoy as a consumer because it does give us access to information, which I think is one of the key things that we do through the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, one of those government agencies that we do talk about or did talk about. So we'll talk about, understand the meaning of securities, difference between public offering and subsequent. We talk a little bit about that. Applies ways in which the laws cover, certainly. Evaluate when and why private individuals and organizations make claims. State regulation. I'm going to tell you, Montana doesn't have a lot of state regulation. Obviously we're a relatively small state. We don't have a ton of state regulation like New York would have. And Dodd-Frank, we're going to touch on. Okay, and admittedly, it's a relatively new law that just hasn't been totally filtered out yet. We don't know what all of its impact is going to be. So the U.S. financial markets, and this is kind of old, I had through 1996. It's got bank deposits on here too, and you can see how the security markets and market value, simply the total number of shares outstanding times the price of those stocks all added up. But 96 had just over 7 trillion by 2005, so a mere 9 years later. It had gone up to 17 trillion, so it had more than doubled. But here we are then, and you can see in 2005 it was right there about that 17 trillion, and here we are in 2015. So an additional 10 years later, it hadn't quite doubled in that time though, because it's at 27. So from 17 to 27 is not a doubling. So it actually performed better from 95, say, really here at 5 trillion to 2005, where it went up to triple, right, over 17 trillion. So it slowed down a little bit. Okay, to be expected. Fewer new companies maybe coming on and whatnot. You know what? When I Googled first ever stock exchange, I think this is what came up, and I have no idea if it is or not. But so securities regulation, and you guys all remember the Great Depression. You remember reading and hearing about the Great Depression. I might have been around when it happened, but not too much. But anyhow, securities regulation began, of course, due to the Great Depression. If you remember, the Great Depression, the onset was with the great market crash of October of 1929, right, when we had the huge market crash, and there was a lot of reasons for that. But partly, we had an unregulated securities industry, and so there's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of it was due to the margin accounts that people were allowed to have back then. But this isn't a history lesson, so we'll kind of move on. So really here is what I find important anyhow. It's that securities regulations are designed to give potential investors factual information to make informed decisions. So companies that are public, have to provide information to us, and we can get it online on a quarterly basis, updates on what's going on, with our companies or companies that we're maybe interested in purchasing shares of. Okay, there are federal and state laws, and again, Montana, not a ton of state regulations regarding security. Some, and there were substantial modifications in Sarbanes-Oxley. Dodd-Frank, I think, had more to do with banking industry and separation of banking from other types of businesses that those holding companies might do. Here's kind of the Securities Act in 33 and then the Securities Exchange Act in 34. So again, both during the Depression. We had insider trading and security fraud dating in 1988. There was a big market sell-off too in 1987, a big market collapse. It lost a quarter of its value in just a couple of days. A few other things added. 2002 with Sarbanes-Oxley. This was really at the end of the dot-com bubble that burst, and then Dodd-Frank came about as a result of the financial crisis that we had 2007 through 2009. So a securities investment, what is it? It exists when a person invests and others manage it for profit. So we talk a lot about the public, but it doesn't necessarily have to be publicly traded. Okay. For example, I still own a few shares of stock in Independence Bank. It's closely held, so it's not really publicly traded. I can sell my stock to anybody. Okay, there's no restriction on that, but there's just not a set market for it, the kind of liquidity that we'd have. But anyhow, it's still a security. Okay, the questions are this: it's a Howey test, they call it. Is it a common business activity, something that anybody might engage in? And don't get into specifics. Is it retail? Is it finance? Is it something like that? Just general. Profits earned through the efforts of someone else. So can I purchase that and somebody else does it? Meaning that it's not really a security if it's the family farm. Okay, and those things are held closely. Okay. Is there a reasonable expectation of profit? Notice it doesn't say a guarantee of profit. So the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, was created, in 1934-35, right? It's got, just like any administrative agency, quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial powers, okay, investigation powers, all those other things. And it regulates these things, stock exchanges. Makes sense. The New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ are the two major ones. You should know that. There's a good chance I'll ask that on a test. New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, and the NASDAQ, National Association of Security Dealers Automated Quotients. Utility holding companies. I think that's put in there because they were often utility holding companies, kind of monopoly power, or they have monopoly power. And there's a reason for that. Cities, local areas, typically get their power from one source, and that's because you wouldn't want 37 different pipelines coming into Havre, or 37 different electrical lines, power lines, right, coming into Havre. And so they've kind of allowed those monopolies to exist, but they are regulated, right? Investment trusts. Kind of goes back to the antitrust stuff that we talked about and how those were set up. And then investment advisors, your local person, right? Your local D.A. Davidson or Raymond James or Edward Jones or Waddell and Reed, right? So the Securities Act in 33, this talked about the disclosures and going public. So when a company first goes public, right? Okay, there's sanctions, violations. If those violations are intentional, there can be criminal, civil, or injunction. Same thing that we've discussed in law throughout, right? Parties that have to comply are those that are the issuers. Okay, the issuers are the companies that end up selling the stock. The underwriters, there's usually a group of underwriters that guarantee the sale of the stock. Okay, controlling persons, those are the people who, like Sergey and whatnot when Google went public, or Mark Zuckerberg, right, when Facebook went public. People that own a controlling interest in the stock at the time that it goes public, and then the sellers, which would include others, right, that may be selling stock, have stock as initial investors, and are selling it during that original IPO. So registration statement. Don't get into a ton of these. Know a little bit of the definitions, right? That's where they disclose the financial information. There is a pre-filing period. The tombstone ad, I got to ask a question about a tombstone ad. Anything with something like that. And really what that was an ad literally that they used to put in the Wall Street Journal. It used to be required to be in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if that's a requirement anymore. And it looked like a tombstone. And so that's why they called it that. And it announced that, there was a sale going to take place, and where you could get the financial information and that type of stuff if you wanted to be an investor. And there'd be a post-effective period after the ad had ran its course. So prospectus, is the final financials. So a company has to close out a year, say, or close out a quarter. They have to give updated financial information. and it has to be provided to people that are interested investors. Okay, it has to have detailed facts about the issues, and sometimes beyond just the financials, right? But also, of course, detailed financial information, maybe including some projections and those types of things. So as you might imagine, and this happened, I think a couple of you had some white collar crimes that you listed that dealt with securities violations and criminal penalty for willful violation, right? So a fraud, an absolute untrue statement of material fact, and those were the white collar ones that you guys pointed out, where people just blatantly said, "Here, I've got some stock to sell in this company," kind of like I have a bridge to sell you in Arizona or something. Okay, and they were successful in selling the stock for whatever reason, but that's definitely fraud. Something that omits material facts or omits information resulting in misleading the potential investor. Now, a lot of these big IPOs, like when Facebook went IPO or Twitter or Square just went IPO not too long ago, the underwriters and those folks work hard to ensure that there isn't fraud actually taking place. So when you're purchasing stock in one of those companies, it's a little less likely that there would be fraud. It's kind of some of those local ones, right? If there's an attempt to defraud, there has to be an attempt to obtain money, property by untrue, or an attempt to engage in a right? So basically just definitions of fraudulent transactions, you probably won't need to worry about those. Materiality is kind of one of those gray areas, but information that a prudent investor would use. And so, disclosing other facts, and sometimes, again, these are sort of away from the financials. If the company were being sued, okay, and for a major amount of money, that would be considered material. If the company felt the lawsuit was a frivolous lawsuit, and that happens, they may not mention that, in the prospectus, because they feel that it's frivolous, and that may be okay. Sometimes those become not frivolous, and then of course you'll get in trouble maybe for not disclosing it. And so materiality is an important issue, and the company has to decide what is material and what might not be. So the statute of limitations on people going back and filing those kinds of fraudulent claims against a company that does an IPO is 1 year after it's discovered. Okay, so when you make a discovery of something like that, you have 1 year, or no more than 3 years after the public filing. Okay, due diligence says that you as an investor have a requirement to reasonably review the financials. So you have to look that over. So we'll pause there, and we'll come back to part 2 a little later.